Hi, everyone. So we'll continue our discussion on rhetoric by taking a look at fallacies. In this particular lecture, we'll take a look at emotion-based fallacies. So in our previous video, we looked at how we can use language, word choice, phrases to influence people's perspective on a claim. Because words have psychological impact. So we can psychologically move people towards seeing a claim a certain way by the way we choose our phrasing of our claim. We refer to these as rhetorical devices, but rhetorical devices are not just about language choice, word choice. Rhetorical devices also include phrasing things in a way that sound like reasons for believing a conclusion, when in fact they're not reasons at all, right? This is referred to as pseudo-reasoning. This is when we present premises that sound like part of a legitimate argument, but do not really give good reasons to believe a conclusion. So, as a result, this sort of pseudo-reasoning leads to fallacies. And fallacies are mistakes in reasoning. Okay, so we'll take a look at various common fallacies that involve emotion, specifically emotion. So the first clip we looked at was of a parody of all the various news talk shows where the host often gets the audience riled up emotionally, and by getting the audience to feel certain ways that align with how the host feels, the host is then able to more easily, oftentimes able to easily move the audience, towards the conclusion they want to draw, even though the reasons to believe the conclusion are either unclear or not very good. So in this clip, you saw Stephen Colbert comedically portray a talk show host, and the issue that he was dealing with was daylight savings. And I hope you noticed that Colbert tried to elicit outrage from the audience, right? Yeah, of course, in a comedic way, because it wasn't real. In fact, the show that he was on, the Colbert Report, was a show that often highlighted the rhetoric used by talk show hosts to convince audiences of particular viewpoints, right? So by highlighting rhetoric and highlighting fallacies, he was hoping to show people how absurd some of the claims and lines of reasoning were of these talk show hosts. But in this particular case, he took on the issue of daylight savings, and what he used or highlighted was the fallacy of argument from outrage. So he wanted to get the audience outraged, or again, when we say wanted to, it's satire. So he was making fun of talk show hosts who often want to get their audience outraged at the same things that they're outraged by, and then use that feeling, that common emotion, to go, see, that's why you should believe me when I say this about a certain claim. So instead of providing an actual premise to believe a conclusion, an argument from outrage uses language to elicit an emotional response of anger, right? So inflammatory words. And then hopefully by getting the audience to feel this anger, they can then lead the audience towards the conclusion. So the argument from outrage substitutes anger for reason. Again, the fallacy is that there's no evidence per se to believe the claim, that there isn't an actual reason provided to believe that the claim is true. Instead, it's strictly based upon getting other people to feel outraged along with you, and then say, that's why you should believe my claim. The second video we saw, again dealing with this the same parody, we saw Colbert deal with the issue of landscaping and poked fun at scapegoating, right? The idea that it's easy to spark outrage, it's easy to trigger people to feel outrage towards certain groups, right? So this is a special type of argument from outrage. So this is when we incite anger by blaming a certain group of people or a single person for problems. And then once again, you get your audience or your listener or whoever it is you're you're talking with to feel the outrage that you feel, and then once you have this common bond, you go, that's why you should believe what I'm saying about this issue, or where to vote, or what to do about X, Y, or Z, right? Again, not evidence based, not an actual reason to believe the claim is true, but simply by establishing a bond through this emotional response. But hey, I'm outraged about this, and then you get the audience to be outraged about the same thing, and then you can push them towards your view of a claim, right? So you can imagine, or maybe you can recall, politicians or other talking heads that always blame certain groups of people, whether it's certain religious groups or certain ethnicities, or just the idea of immigrants, and say, we need to do this about this law regarding the border, or we need to do this regarding this law about documentation, or this about this law regarding jobs. And if they try to incite outrage by blaming a certain group for problems without providing actual evidence to support their claims about those issues, this is a fallacy, right? Because arguments are based upon reason, evidence to support certain conclusions. Oftentimes we'll hear these talking heads just try to get people riled up by saying certain ethnicities, certain groups, certain religious organizations, and automatically people, because of their psychology, get riled up. And then you go, that's why you should believe X, Y, and Z. And if people fall prey to this and start to believe X, Y, and Z, they're falling prey to this fallacy. So we should be careful, because just because an argument is said with anger doesn't mean it is a fallacy, right? So I can be outraged when I give you an argument. I could blame a group when I give you an argument, but there still could be an argument there, right? Just because I'm angry doesn't make it a fallacy. It only makes it a fallacy if I only give you anger and not an actual reason to believe my claim. So if I said something like, Sarah owns a LeBlanc saxophone. Since LeBlanc makes all their instruments in France, Sarah must own a French saxophone, damn it. Okay, so I may be outraged when I say the argument, but the argument is still there, right? So it isn't really a fallacy. So just something to keep in mind as you are listening or reading different arguments from different people. Oftentimes, as you mentioned last time, people will combine arguments with rhetoric to try to move people towards action, right? Okay, let's take a look at this. A salesman says, buy Michelin tires. Don't risk your child's safety by buying inferior brands. Can you see what they're trying to do there? Or how about this person? A political pundit says, don't vote for him. He doesn't scare the terrorists. He's in office. The terrorists will surely strike again. Both of these speakers are trying to elicit fear, right? They try to scare their listener or viewer. So what we say is that instead of reason, they are substituting reason for fear, right? To try to scare us into accepting or doing something. Now, on the surface, you might hear these arguments and say, wait a minute, that's an actual reason. I don't want my kids to not be safe. I don't want to be attacked by terrorists. Okay, let's take a closer look at these arguments, or these pseudo-arguments, right? So the salesman, buy Michelin tires. Okay, so if you're going to make an argument for buying Michelin tires, well, there should be evidence about Michelin tires, right? Evidence why other brands have tires that aren't as good as Michelin tires, or why buying other brands will be of a detriment as compared to buying Michelin tires. The second sentence, however, just says, don't risk your children's safety by buying inferior brands. It actually doesn't say anything about Michelin tires. It doesn't even say that Michelin tires are superior in terms of safety than other brands. It infers it. And in fact, even if it says, ours would keep your child more safe, they should provide some sort of evidence for that, right? Some sort of reason to believe it to be true. That would be an actual argument. In this case, we can easily see all they're trying to do is scare the reader, if it's a text ad, right? Scare the potential customer to buying their tires, right? So fear instead of actual reason. Same thing with the Political Pundit. Don't vote for him. He doesn't scare the terrorists. If he's in office, the terrorists will surely strike again. Well, obviously, nobody wants to be attacked by terrorists. But what is it exactly about the candidate that would make our country more prone to terrorist attack? What is it about the candidate's policies? What is it about the candidate in terms of his style of leadership or her style of governing that would make our country less safe? Those would be evidence to support the idea that we shouldn't vote for him or her. But instead, this person simply plays off of our fear of terrorists without any sort of actual reason to believe the candidate would make us less safe. They're simply playing off of our fear of terrorists to move us towards not voting for them. I hope that's obvious, that they're not actually providing a reason. They're just trying to elicit an emotion. A reason would be to give us a reason to believe why we'd be less safe. Okay? Scare tactic. There is a special type of scare tactic where instead of just generally causing fear, the speaker is specifically addressing fear to your personhood, right? This is argument from force, using personal threats to convince someone to accept or do something. So if you take this ad, buy Michelin tires, don't risk your children's safety by buying inferior brands, you can change it to a different type of scare tactic by phrasing it this way: buy Michelin tires or I'll run you over. So no actual reason pertaining to the tires themselves why we should buy them. Instead, they use fear, and in particular, fear of personal harm, right, to convince people to buy their tires. Or buy Michelin tires or I'll eat your children. Again, it's fear-based, right? They try to get you afraid. And in this particular type of scare tactic, argument for force, the fear comes from possible personal harm. All right. So hopefully you notice that it's still a scare tactic because it's still using fear instead of reason to make a person believe something. But this type of fear has to do with a personal threat. If we take a look at the Political Pundit example, don't vote for him. He doesn't scare the terrorists. If he's in office, the terrorists will surely strike again. We can come up with millions. We can come up with several different reasons or ways of expressing this as a argument from force. You could say something like, don't vote for him or I'll have you fired. Notice it's a personal threat. Or don't vote for him or I'll expose your affair on television. Again, notice it's a personal threat, right? So still using fear instead of an actual reason. By the way, if it's not clear, right, don't vote for him or I'll have you fired. Having you fired has nothing to do with the candidate. Being exposed for your affair having your affair exposed on television has nothing to do with the candidate. That's why they're referred to as fallacies instead of actual arguments, right? Okay. 5, we'll take a look at argument from pity. Now just think, we're trying to get an emotional response from people. So in this case, we're trying to elicit pity from the listener. We want the listener or the reader to feel pity for you or somebody involved with the claim. So, for example, Professor, you should give me an A on the midterm. My wife just left me and my child has only one good eye. Okay, so having your wife leave you and the condition of your child are horrible in this case. They affect your well-being, sure. Not too clear as to why it justifies a teacher giving an A on a midterm, right? So what it does instead is it makes the listener, or hopes to elicit within the listener, a feeling of pity. So if you can get the listener on your side by having them feel pity, then you can more easily or possibly move them towards believing the claim you want them to believe in. Again, it's about eliciting pity in the person you're trying to convince, right? That's important because you're trying to convince somebody of a belief. So you want them to feel pity towards you or somebody else, and that be what moves them to believe the claim you want them to believe in. Similar to this is argument from envy. Again, you want the you want the listener or the person you're speaking to feel envious of somebody. And remember, since we're trying to convince them of something, you want to have a shared bond so that you both feel envious of somebody, right? So you make them feel envious of somebody else, and you use that envy to move them towards seeing a claim the way you want them to see it. You shouldn't let Bill Gates off the hook for a traffic violation. He's a millionaire and owns half the universe. Okay, so you're trying to get the listener to feel envy, be envious of Bill Gates. And if you can share that, if you can get them to feel envy for a person that you want them to feel envy to, then you establish an emotional bond, and then maybe it's easier for you to get them to believe a claim that you want them to believe. Number 7, argument from pride, also known as apple polishing. In this case, you want to appeal to their ego. You want to appeal to their sense of pride. So you want to be complimentary. You want them to feel good about themselves. And again, when you do that, you get this bond between the two of you, between you and your audience. And then once you get that bond, emotional connection, it might be easier to move them to believe the same claim you believe. So, for example, officer, thank you for protecting my neighborhood and keeping us safe. If you think I was speeding, I must have been, but do you think you can find it in your kind heart to let me go this one time? So see, you're stroking their ego, you're trying to make them feel good about themselves, you're appealing to their sense of pride. And because you are appealing to that emotion, hopefully it's easier for you as a speaker to move people towards your belief. On the flip side, you as the speaker or the listener, you as the audience member, should be aware that this might be happening to you, that somebody might be saying words and phrases or expressing their claim in a way that is meant to trigger these sorts of feelings so that you can recognize them and go, wait a minute, am I being psychologically manipulated, emotionally manipulated to believe a claim? Or is there an actual reason to believe it, right? If you're the police officer, wait a minute, is there an actual reason why I should not give them a ticket? Is there actual evidence to support the idea that I should not be giving them a speeding ticket? Or am I maybe leaning towards that direction because they've made me feel good about myself, because they've made me envious of somebody, right? So it's about self-awareness, being aware of your emotions so that when you are mulling over an issue, you can see the rhetoric over the argument. You can see the rhetoric embedded within the argument. Or you can see that it's just rhetoric and there's actually no argument at all. So one of the things we do in our live class is we get into groups, and I ask you to use these fallacies that you've just learned to try to convince your instructor to give you a good grade on your midterm. Okay, so obviously there's no group here for you to do this with, so I'm hoping you take some time, press pause, and actually try to create on your own some fallacies. What would you say to your instructor to convince them to give you a good grade on your midterm, using an argument from outrage, using an argument using a scapegoat, using scare tactics, using an argument from force, using an argument from pity, using an argument from envy, and using an argument from pride. Hopefully you take a minute or two, come up with some ideas, and then come back to the video. Okay, so I hope you've had a minute or two to write down some possibilities here. I'll share with you some that we have in class, or we've had in class. So these are actually from students. Some of these fit, they're actually appropriate for the given fallacy, and some aren't. So it's good to see the difference. It helps us to understand these a little bit better. Okay. So first, argument from outrage. Give me an A because I got all the answers right. The machine clearly doesn't work. Okay, so here you are, and this is what you're telling your teacher. Remember, you want to convince the teacher of your claim. You want to convince the teacher of a certain belief. So in this case, you want to convince the teacher that they should give you an A. Well, argument from outrage is about getting them on your side by having them be outraged at something that you're also outraged by, right? So if you say, give me an A because I got all the answers right, Well, I mean, that's not really going to get the teacher on your side. They're not going to be outraged at the same thing you're outraged at. The second sentence, the machine clearly doesn't work. It just sounds like you're complaining. You might be outraged by the machine, but you want to convince the teacher of your claim. You want them to be on your side, so you want to pick something that they would be outraged at too. So yeah, if your teacher may have been complaining about how the machine that they've been using doesn't work very well, their Scantron machine, and they bitch and moan about it, and you know they're outraged about it, then possibly this would work. But as it is, it just sounds like the student's complaining. You gave BS lectures, you owe us A's. Again, I like to remind you, these are actual responses from students in class doing this exercise. So again, you have the same sort of issue here. Is the student's example is one in which they are really just complaining. They are outraged. But the point is not that the speaker's outraged. You want to get your listener outraged, right? If you think about talk show hosts or politicians in debates, they're trying to get the public outraged at the same things they're outraged at, so that they can be on the same side, and you can convince your listener to agree with you on certain claims. So when you say to a teacher, "You gave BS lectures," you're actually just insulting the teacher, right? You might be outraged, but it doesn't really help you convince a teacher of your claim. Finally, I know that the pay isn't good, and half the students are so lazy that they don't even read. That's why you should give me an A. Well, this would be much closer to working, right? So they don't really give the teacher an actual reason why the student deserves an A, but instead what they do is they try to relate to the teacher by getting them outraged or pretending as if they're outraged by something the teacher would normally be outraged by, right? Which is low salaries and students who don't read much. So this would be a good example, or a better example of the first two of an argument from outrage. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now remember, scapegoating is just another type of argument from outrage. So we're trying to get, again, our audience, in this case a teacher, to be outraged with us. But now we're trying to cause that outrage by referring to a certain group, right? A certain group of people that the teacher might also be outraged by. First example, again, from our real live students in class. You should give me a good grade on the midterm. The people who wrote the textbook didn't explain anything. Well, in a sense, they're blaming the authors, but it's very unlikely that your teacher has an issue with the authors. They chose the textbook. If you're going to scapegoat somebody, you want to make sure that it's going to elicit the response in your audience that you want to elicit, right? So this wouldn't really work. The second one, the questions were so hard and you want us to fail, so you should give everyone an A. So again, the student is scapegoating the teacher. He's blaming the teacher for his problems. But remember, for the fallacy, you want your listener, you want the person you're trying to convince to also be outraged with you. In this case, your outrage is towards the teacher. The teacher is not going to be outraged at himself or herself, right? So this would not work, okay? I should have gotten an A on this midterm, but the immigrants next to me were noisy. This has a better shot, or it's much more in line with an argument from using scapegoating, especially if you know that the teacher has an issue with immigrants, right? But it's obvious that the intent here is to use immigrants as a scapegoat. So this would be an example of an argument using a scapegoat. Okay, so this would work. Hopefully that makes some sense. Scare tactics. So remember, we're trying to get the person you are speaking to feel fear, right? So we're going to use fear instead of a reason to believe you should get a good grade. If you don't get a good grade, the terrorists will win. Okay, so this is a decent example of a scare tactic because you're trying to elicit fear within the teacher, right? Because nobody wants the terrorists to win, so it's scary to think the terrorists would win. So please give me a good grade because we don't want that to happen. Again, notice that it's not an actual argument, right? There's nothing that talks about why grades are related to terrorism. So it's simply to elicit fear in the listener. If you don't raise my grade, puppies will die. Well, again, this seems to be a scare tactic because you're trying to get the teacher to be fearful of puppies dying. So you elicit that sense of fear. And hopefully, if you get them to be on your side about how that's scary, it'll be easier to convince them to give you the grade. But again, it's a fallacy, right? So hopefully it's obvious why it's a fallacy, because there's nothing here that talks about the connection between puppies dying and grading. Why puppies dying will result from doing something, having a certain grade. So, but it is a fallacy, right? Scare tactic. You should give me a good grade. You wouldn't want me to end up as just another statistic. If you're not familiar with this phrase, end up as just another statistic, it often refers to people who, die prematurely, who have a short life, things of that nature. So the student is trying to scare the teacher, saying, "Hey, my life will be ruined, and that's a scary thought. So please give me a good grade." Okay. Again, it's not an actual reason, right? Because there's nothing relating this particular grade to shorten life for the student. So it's a fallacy. And hopefully these all make sense, that they're all examples of scare tactics. So argument from force, remember, is a type of scare tactic. We are, again, trying to use fear, try to get the person you're speaking to feel fear. But this time, we want that fear to be a personal type of fear, not just some sort of generic fear, but fear for their personhood. Okay. You should give me an A or I will scratch your car. Good. That's an argument from force, because scratching your car is very personal. Again, it's a fallacy because that's not real justification for why you deserve an A. If you don't give me a good grade, I will slash your tires. Again, good example, right? It's personal, about slashing a person's tires. So you're eliciting fear in that sense. You should give me a good grade if you know what is good for you. Okay, so that's a colloquial phrase. If you know what is good for you, it's a threat, right? So these are all good examples of arguments from force. I think it's kind of funny how scare tactics and arguments from force are pretty easy for students to come up with examples for. Argument from pity. So remember, we're trying to get your audience, you're trying to get the person you're speaking to feel pity. And if you get them to feel pity for the same things you feel you have a sense of pity for, then you have a better chance of moving them towards your side of the issue. Give me an A on my midterm because I broke my leg running to class today. Okay, good. So you're trying to elicit a sense of pity from your teacher. Professor, I work 2 jobs to support my 10 adopted children and didn't have time to study. We barely make enough to get by. Again, there's nothing about questions that are answered or quality of the performance of the student. It's simply there to elicit a pity response from the instructor. So this is an argument from pity. Good example. My mom is dying. Again, this is a literal example from past classes. This is also a good example from an argument from pity. So argument from envy. So think again what we're trying to do. With argument from envy, we're trying to get a rapport between you and the person you're trying to convince. And we do that by having somebody or pointing to somebody that you can both be envious of, right? And if you can get your listener or the person you're speaking with to be envious of somebody along with you, then you establish a rapport and you're more likely, or you can make it more likely to manipulate them to believe a certain claim. So if I said something like, if everybody else gets an A, then I better get an A. Well, I mean, you might be expressing how you're envious of fellow classmates, but that's not going to establish a rapport between you and your instructor, right? Because the instructor will not be envious of another student getting an A. You want to find somebody that the instructor is envious of and use that as a way to connect with them and then have a better shot of convincing them to give you the A. All the cool teachers give students A's on their midterms. Well, you may be trying to get the teacher envious of other teachers, but by saying all the cool teachers give A's on their midterms, you're more likely just to irritate your instructor, say he's not really cool unless he does what you want. right? Remember, you're trying to establish rapport here. You're trying to get them to be envious of somebody that you are also envious of, so that you can be on the same side. Computer programmers don't do nearly as much good in society as teachers, but earn 3 times as much. It would be great if you gave me an A so we can change that. Here we have an appropriate argument from envy, right? So the speaker is trying to convince the teacher to be, or trying to elicit envy of computer programmers. And once you're able to, if you're able to elicit that sense of envy, then you can have them be more towards your side, and you can maybe have a better chance of convincing them to give you the A. Again, we are talking about this from the speaker's point of view, but as a listener, you have to be careful. Ask yourself, is somebody trying to elicit an emotional response from me? Is there an actual argument if I look beyond my emotional response, right? So am I being led to envy? Is there manipulation going on here of my emotions? Is there an actual reason why I should change a grade? Okay. Our last one is argument from pride. So again, you're trying to appeal to the listener's sense of ego, right? Their sense of pride. We should all get good grades. You are such a good professor. How could your students not get good grades? Okay, so this is very good. I think you're the best professor here. You should give me an A on the test. Again, good, right? You're appealing to your instructor's sense of self-worth, trying to make them feel good about themselves. You should give me a passing grade on this test so I don't have to drop. You're such a good teacher. I don't want to drop this class with so much more for me to learn from you. Okay, so these are all about making the listener feel good about themselves. And if you're able to do that, the better chance that they'll be on your side for the claim you want them to believe in, that you should get a good grade or get an A. Okay, so hopefully these make sense.